Alright, finally back with another fake rock waterfall. Got a autumn themed waterfall here and introduced some artificial lighting you can see on the right there to try to simulate an early morning sunrise. And I ended up messing with the camera's white balance a little bit to try to give it that orange glow. But anyway, I got a project here that I took nearly 4 months to make this. Quite a bit of detail, quite a bit of color variation. Process of creating those leaves was intricate, but I'll go through that process later. This was more meant to be a tabletop waterfall than a waterfall built for a pet. But you can certainly build this with the idea of building it for a pet and then use certain non-toxic sealants to make sure that it's completely safe. Seeing the back there with the cords to the water pump and the fogger, but seeing the aerial view, hopefully with all the detail of the leaves. Here is where the second piece that camouflages the water pump. So you can easily take that off and get to the water filter. And you can see the fog gets kind of out of control. I ended up having that fogging unit underneath that little piece, so it really kind of contained it, makes the fog look a little bit more realistic. Because the amount of water here is really not that much, not enough to, it's not built for that, I guess, level of a fogger. Anyway, putting that second piece back on. And this is what it looked like without the light with the orange gel, and the white balance is normal here. So let's get started. You want to start off wearing, make sure you wear a dust mask of some sort. Either one of these or something a little more elaborate. And I'm going to draw around what I think is going to be the shape of the pond. I end up extending this shape so it's a little bigger. It doesn't look exactly, or end up looking exactly like this. Draw out the area where I think the falls are going to fall. Cut out a whole bunch of pieces that ended up being 2 3/4 inches tall. And I'm going to use a couple of hot wires from the hot wire foam factory. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out and then proceed to cut out a whole bunch of different lengths of this particular height of styrofoam. So using polystyrene here, got varying different sizes so you can go around corners easily. And usually what I do is keep pieces together or stick them together with either nails or toothpicks. So this just lets you change your mind before you end up gluing pieces down. So you can move the pieces around before you end up committing to gluing them. So using Loctite's Power Grab, here I'm going to glue these pieces down. And generally this is a glue that you really want to let dry for about 24 hours. And because you're going around these different curves, you're going to end up with these gaps. And you can either fill them in with pieces of smaller polystyrene, or you can use some of that same glue, the Loctites or any other glue, to patch up some of these gaps that happen. So I'm going to put this upside down onto another sheet of polystyrene, and I'm going to trace around this. Now this is kind of an elaborate way of building up the landscape that's around that pond. And there's a different way of doing this. You could just put various pieces of polystyrene to build up around those little rectangles that I had going. So I'm pointing out that larger piece of polystyrene there, and I'm going to cut this piece in half so that I can trace around and essentially create some larger pieces that will be able to wrap around those pieces you initially saw. So cutting through that with the hot wire, then tracing around the second piece, again cutting through the thicker polystyrene, and it fits back together in that shape of the pond shape that I initially created. So this will then, because I traced around that, will fit perfectly in building up the landscape around those little rectangles that make up the pond. So I'm then putting the smaller pieces on there to, this was just sort of luck that happened to be the right height. So there you can see the landscape built up around the pond. Again, you could do this a completely different way. And here is that where one of those ways, using the flexible hot wire, you can dig into, like if you were to use a couple of larger, thicker pieces of polystyrene to essentially create that pond in a much more easy, probably much more organic looking way. I'm going to go ahead and glue on those thicker pieces. And using the hot wire, going to try to get rid of some of these straight edges that go into the pond, trying to make it look a little bit more organic and natural. So then I've got the pump filter there, and I'm going to try to use some of that thicker foam to build up around it, because I know I'm going to have the foam go at least a little bit taller, inch or two taller than the filter, to be able to cover it. So constantly putting the filter back in, making sure it's going to be able to fit. I've got that piece there that goes right up to the edge of the filter to catch the water coming out, holding it together with some nails. This is something I usually do, taking a black magic marker with pieces that you haven't yet glued together, just to make sure you know exactly where they're supposed to fit when you glue them together. As you can see right there, if I were to have worked on that and then come back after a week of not being able to work on it, I'll know exactly where I'm supposed to glue it. And then just putting in random pieces in order to cover up that filter. Building up that, what will end up being where the water comes out into the bigger pond, with some larger pieces of polystyrene. And then what I decided to do, usually I'll end up making a couple of different decisions where I'll either, decide that the landscape needs to be a little bit bigger for, I guess, the concept to work. So creating an extension of two of the sides, that left side and the front side. So extending the landscape, and then even though there's quite a few sharp edges there, I'll end up going through that with the hot wire to create a much more organic look. Building up that polystyrene where that's where that larger orange tree ended up being, and then created a couple of little ridges there to make sure that the water is going to go where I want it to go. So you can see where that the filter is going to pour out onto that area, and then drew out another little smaller pond, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut that out, as I suggested earlier, with just using the hot wire and being able to cut out a much more organic looking smaller pond. And then using the hot wire to cut through that landscape to try to create a more organic looking landscape. And I ended up changing this quite a bit. I had a little bit of an idea for a design of like where trees were going to be and where the falls were and how many trees or bushes or rocks, but ended up changing it a little bit. You got the beginnings of what that second piece that covers the waterfall pump originated as. So you're just trying to go up and over to give it a little bit of space, make sure that it's going to be able to fit on top of the water pump. So creating the trees that ended up being that little yellow tree in the beginning. Holding it together again with little nails or toothpicks. And then when you've decided you've got the shape you want then going ahead and gluing it together and then gluing it onto the landscape. And then creating that red tree. So it's really just at least these three trees are, three sculpted, they almost look like rocks, and then gluing them together and then bending that hot wire into a shape where you can take little chunks or little divots out of the shape. Ends up looking a little bit like coral, but if you do this enough times, you'll end up creating at least a somewhat more realistic looking tree than if you were to just paint like a solid surface and try to convey shadows and whatnot. So that's how the larger orange tree is looking. And here's where I decided to completely change up the design. Wanted to create that path and there wasn't enough space, and I really didn't want to extend the project any further to the right. So I'm going to close up that little area that wound up being a little over 2 inches and using the hot wire just to go through those two sections and try to pull out that little area and then bring forth that other piece to the right just so I can create a little bit more space on the right for that path. You can see that huge chunk there took out. So sometimes this will happen where you make decisions where you end up having to take apart part of your project to make it work. And building up that wall that ends up being that central rock structure that you saw in the beginning. And essentially just really with the purpose of trying to camouflage that water pump. That's how the top of that second piece is looking, trying to find or follow the contours of the filter. And then using other pieces to mask that front part. And there is that chunk that I ended up taking out. So I'm going to use that as I've got this piece and with the hot wire try to carve out some realistic rock looking face. So carving out that bush that's in the front of the landscape, just doing it the same way that I did the trees, looking a little bit like coral there, just taking more and more divots out of it. Creating some rock panels that will go on to that front part of that secondary piece. And then carving into that second piece with trying to make sure that I'm covering up. You can see that gap there until I glued that little piece right there on there. Is that part of the filter was still showing. And then trying to build up the mouth of the waterfall using some little polystyrene pieces to try to make them look like rocks. And then I wanted to extend the pond area, the larger pond area. So cutting through it with the hot wire there, try to extend that shape of the pond. Now here's where I drew out the path. And as you can see, it used to, originally I wanted it to go off to the left there. Drew out a little design there, but got the hot wire in the shape of like a rectangle using that flat area to try to carve out sort of a worn path look, as if quite a few people have walked along there in the woods to enjoy the waterfall and the trees. Got some rocks for the pond. Ended up putting quite a few rocks in the main pond and the smaller one. So as you can see there, building that up makes it look a lot more realistic, a lot more organic. So gluing in some of those rocks. So here is how it's looking so far. I've got one of the lights off so you can see more of the shadows and contours of how it's actually looking with the tree roots stuff. So I'm going to glue in some rocks, create some more rocks, and try to build up the realistic look of the landscape. Glue in that bush, that front bush that was on there. And putting in, just as I put in some rocks in the lower, larger pond, gonna glue in some rocks in that upper pond and then put in that little lip of which the water flows over. Putting some rocks on that camouflaging section, that second piece, and some bushes. Now I've got the hot wire in this type of shape, so it's I can create this rounded look. Trying to go along all of the edges around it to try to take off that sharp edge so that it'll have this rounded look. And then going in, and it'll just be inevitable that you've got a ton of gaps that you don't want to fill up with the foam coat or any other type of mortar. So I'm going to put in either pieces of foam or some of that glue to cover those up. Now here's a decision I made to cut the trees off before I apply the foam coat or mortar, and to make it easier for it to be painted. They were a little bit awkward in where they were, and the fact that they've got that weak section with where they meet the landscape, I guess, with the trunk. So I ended up cutting those off. They're on there right now because they weigh almost nothing because they're foam, and I'll end up taking them off there later. But there's the finished polystyrene sculpt. Go ahead and take the trees off. So I'll coat those separately, and of course I'll coat the camouflaging piece separately. So I've got a little break here. You want to check out these links to these other videos. Some of these videos I've made myself. In my opinion, these links to these videos are way more important than the video you're watching now. I will share these links again at the end of the video, but if you want to take the time to check those out, that would be cool. Alright, back to the project here. I've got the foam coat stage. You can use grout. I've used grout in the past successfully. Plus I also used bounce. Now both of these products are from the Hot Wire Foam Factory. So I'm going to mix this together. Just follow their instructions. Takes a certain amount of water, foam coat, and then what's optional is to use a product called bounce that will, just as the foam coat does, it'll essentially add another strengthening agent to the surface of your project. So applying one good layer of foam coat. If you're making this for a living creature, I would probably apply at least 2 to 3 layers, depending on the strength of your critter that you're making this for, or any other of the projects. The more layers you apply, the stronger it's going to be, the more impact resistant. The more layers of bounce you apply, the more impact resistant. So I'm going to continue to try to work this into all of the little crevices and the holes that are just inevitable when you create one of these things. And what you'll probably have to do it was pretty difficult getting that stuff into those little crevices in the trees, is turn it on its side and introduce gravity into the situation to be able to get into all those little areas. And then with this piece, the covering piece and the trees, what I did was just foam coat this right over top of the bowl so that any excess would just fall into that bowl. Then covering the trees there. And what I've got here, I've mixed up a very thick batch of foam coats. So just essentially the same process, it's just a lot less water is put in there. And then what you can do with this, it's got the consistency of clay. You can go back in, and where you think some sharp edges should have been because of the design, you can reestablish those just as you would using clay. And here I've really caked it on to try to enhance that rock look to that covering piece. And then just using my hand with gloves on, trying to get rid of some of those sharper edges. And here using a little bit of fine grade sandpaper and going over that to, one, get rid of the weak parts that are going to happen, that you're going to end up creating using some of that thicker foam coat. Then tipping it over to get some of the excess particles out of there. Now here's an optional stage where I'm going to cover this entire thing in a mixture of water and bounce. So again, bounce from the hot wire foam factory is going to strengthen this project, make it more impact resistant. And then off to the painting stage, I've got acrylic paint, sort of a dark gray or a dark green, mixed with water in a dollar store water bottle. And I'm just going to essentially paint the entire thing this dark color. So you want this dark color on there before you start applying any of your other color, because it'll complement it in many ways. You won't cover all of this up, and you'll end up having this much more detailed look that I'll show later. So everything is covered in that very dark gray or dark green. So I'm going to start painting it now. I've got just putting in grass color. So cover all that up as much as what you think is going to be covered with grass, knowing that you're going to cover up some of that with varying layers and painting decisions, going in and putting in just random detail of highlights in the grass or just other things that are growing, putting in detail of coloring the trees. At this point, what I'm doing here is I've got a very light gray or light brown, and I'm going to get rid of most of the paint on a paper towel, and then going back in on the rock structure or any of the other structures that you're trying to convey the idea of rock. Going in and with this dry brush where you've removed most of the paint, the texture from what is there will pull off some of that lighter color. So because it's originally painted with that dark gray or dark green, that paint is, because it's lighter, will be able to show up in a much more intense way because you've got that darker undercolor. And then going in and trying to apply some different colors, got some brown there, and then putting in some fine detail with some white with a very small brush. Just trying to create more and more layers to create that realistic look of rock. And then going in with another brush with a very dark brown or leaning more towards black to try to suggest cracks in the rocks or like re-emphasize grooves that are actually in the structure. And here what I'm doing is applying a water-resistant sealant, sort of a temporary sealant so that I can test this out. And what you want to do is at least a couple of times test out whether or not there are any major structural problems in your project, because you want to find out now as opposed to after you've put even more time into it. And then going back in and putting in some random detail of a darker color just to give the project a little bit more depth, a little bit more volume. And beginning to paint the trees. Got painting that larger orange tree, and starting off with a really faded, almost rust-like color to give that base color to the tree. Going in to paint the yellow tree, you can really see the benefit of having that darker undercolor, because if you were doing this in a hurry or if you didn't want to put that much time into the detail, you can kind of see how it already sort of looks like a tree with that natural negative space of whenever you look at a tree or picture of a tree, you're going to see all those shadows of those little tiny dark spots in the tree that give it that depth. And going in with that red tree, putting in an under layer of like a more faded red. And then it's really just a process of creating these layers where I'm going back in with a more true orange, and then I'll probably cover up 90% of that layer with something else. So with the yellow tree, going in with more of a true yellow, and then I'll come back and maybe add more negative space with that red tree. Going in, and it's like a red leaning more towards an orange color there for a highlight. Going back in with the yellow tree and applying that negative space, dark colored paint, just again giving more volume. And there's how that's looking. And then just going in randomly, creating some detail, some fine detail with a really small brush. So whatever this happens to be, something growing on the steps there leading to the path. And then preparing the path, getting it a good dark brown undercolor. And then going in, again using the dry brush technique and applying highlights and making sure that the, edges of the path are a little bit darker, suggesting that, there's a lot of people that have walked through this path and they've worn it in the middle over the years. And just taking, at this point, a really light brown that would be the, final layer to that dry brush technique for the path. Then going in with yet more detail in the trees to, create the look of, small leaves on the trees. Going in with the orange tree, creating yet more detail, more color variation. I have some more true orange. Ended up putting some red in that orange tree, put in some yellow, as you can see there. And you're really just trying to give this more complex look, depending on how much time you want to put into this. So going back in with the orange tree and putting in some of that negative space, because that's, again, really going to add to the realistic look of your trees. And with that bush in front, it's already got the darker layer, and putting in some very light green, almost leaning towards yellow. And then going back in and putting in some highlights of some sort of color as to what you want the leaves to be. Got a dramatic close-up there. So you can see that the more layers, the more detail you put in, the more convincing it's going to be that it's actually looking like a bush or looking like the grass or the path or the trees. So putting in detail on that top covering piece. And going in after I videotaped after one of those tests to see if there were any leaks, if there was anything wrong structurally, figured out where the water line was, and now what I'm doing to that upper smaller pond and then the larger pond is going to color what I know is going to be the surface that's going to be covered with water, coloring it in a sort of aqua color. So all of the surface area that is going to be underwater, to give it that look of a swamp. So hey, we're going to try to glue on the trees here using Mod Podge glue. So I glued these on. I ended up having to prop them up and just leave them there for a couple of days, and then putting in a little bit more glue. Make sure those guys are not going to go anywhere. Now here's something different. I ended up using or buying this visor for $1 off, well, it was in some arts and crafts store, but primarily because it has this flexible foam like quality. And this is how I ended up doing most of the leaves, creating these leaf stamps out of that foam and essentially gluing them to the top of a pencil and letting those dry again for probably 48 hours. I'm going to go back in and apply a little bit more detail to the tree, in this case the tree roots. So I'm doing dry brush technique using black, and then once that's dry, using a very light brown, basically a beige, going over the tree roots, the trunk of the tree. And here is the back of the project. There's really nothing structural to the back of the project. It just ended up being flat because I didn't really do anything to it, but decided just to randomly dry brush that with a very light gray. And you can see how, even though there's no real structural, spatial decisions that I did back here, it's just flat. With that dry brush technique and then going back in and putting in some fake cracks with some black paint, it'll at least look acceptable if someone looks back there. So here is the leaf stamp. So applying that, some of the stamps worked better than others. And just putting in a lot of, trying to put in a lot of color variation, putting in some black leaves, some dark brown. Putting in some crossover color, because I've got the orange tree with the yellows, so there'd be yellow leaves, you know, where the orange tree is, and vice versa. So this was a fun process, a lot less time consuming than if I were to actually paint each and every leaf. So working on what would be the orange tree. And of course I did go back in and hand paint several leaves, but some of the stamps didn't look too well. It looks like a little bit of a starfish right there. So there you've got most of the leaves I ended up doing, but like I say, some of them didn't look right. So I went back in and probably hand painted a couple of dozen, and sometimes just adding to what the leaf stamp had already created, and just trying to create a, you know, if someone looks at it up close, you know, see a little bit more realistic of a shape. Doing yet another test, make sure there's no structural problems. And another thing is to make sure that the water line is looking accurate. So I've got paper towels just to see if there's a subtle leak that's, you know, in the bottom of it. It'll eventually come down and saturate those towels to let you know that there is a problem. So what I'm doing here is applying a sealant. I ended up choosing a different sealant this time around, is because it has a more of a matte finish. But if you're creating this for a living creature, you really want to try to use Shields All. I'll try to have the link in the description, but it is a completely non-toxic sealant. But ended up applying 4 layers of this sealant and covering those other separate, or just, I guess it's just the one separate piece because the trees are glued on separately. And look how beautiful the bottom of that turned out. Is that fantastic or what? But yeah, you even want to seal the bottom of it. Of course, I'm going to take this separate piece off and seal it separately. Now, once all those layers are dry, I'm going to add a little bit of sealant to where those two pieces are touching. And then I'm going to sprinkle fine grade sand on that. So this acts as a barrier. If you apply any sealant, you're going to end up with more of a tacky surface, and those two pieces are going to have the potential to stick together. So that sand acts as a barrier to prevent that from happening. So I've got the project outside because I'm going to be applying silicone. So I'm going to go all over the areas, the surface area that is going to be underwater 24/7. And what I'm going to do is at least apply a ½ inch above where I know the water line is going to be, just to be safe. So I'm applying this outside because silicone when wet is incredibly toxic. When dry, after 3 days, it's perfectly fine. It can come into contact with food and, perfectly non-toxic. It's what's in the corners of aquariums and has been for decades. So it's perfectly fine when dry, but when wet, you really want to do this outside. Make sure you got protective gloves and maybe goggles and a face mask when applying this stuff. But going to go through all of the areas and try to push this silicone into all the crevices, because at least with this project, there ended up being quite a few little areas where there was smaller crevices than I'm used to dealing with. So then I'm going to let this dry. It's going to be outside for a good 3 days. Make sure it's completely cured. So there you have it, your very own autumn-themed waterfall. So be sure and check out those links to those other videos that I mentioned earlier. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.